Here's Africa in 1950. This is a crop concentration map. The pink and the blue are areas where roughly 1/3 or less of the land is under cultivation. And in a pre-industrial system, this is what you would expect. We don't have this experience in the American Midwest. Our land is too good. But in every other part of the world, most of the lands are subpar. And it takes value-added inputs in order to make them productive. Fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, equipment, finance, takes it all. All of those are industrial technologies. And with 50 years of access to those technologies, this is what Africa became. Over 5 decades, their output increased by a factor of 5. It's one of the great successes of the globalized order. Now take away some of those inputs. Subpar lands, once you apply the technology, have explosive increases, which means if you take away the inputs, they have explosive decreases. Now this next map combines my entire, oh, no, not yet, sorry. Ooh, it's weird when you don't have a confidence monitor, you never know what's next. This is where the world's wheat comes from. The beige are the net exporters, the red are the net importers. The reason I'm putting this up is because of the Russians. The last time the Russians mucked with export markets for wheat and imports, it was 2010. They had a very dry season in Siberia and a lot of their wheat fields burned. On top of the previous year where it had been a wet year and they had locusts. I mean, Russia's very good at plagues. Anyway, in 2010, they had export restrictions that had the net effect, by removing a certain percentage of global production from the market, of doubling wheat prices globally. It tripled in the countries where they were usually the primary supplier, particularly the Middle East. We know the outcome of that is the Arab Spring. And that's nothing compared to the scale of what we're seeing already this year. In fact, even if things with China and Russia and energy went away today, it's probably too late to get the fertilizer created, processed, and distributed before planting season in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a list of the wars in Europe that erupted, that impacted food production and distribution. The Eastern Hemisphere agricultural zones are, as a rule, subpar, and when you mess up the input stream, things get nasty fast. Here's a list for the same time frame for North America. The Midwest is not normal. It rains. It's on a water network for distribution. Nobody else can do that. So yeah, we're looking at a turning of history, but it's turning back. This is my favorite map of all time. So this takes everything that I do in manufacturing and military strategy and energy and agronomics and puts it in one graphic. The countries in the blue in a deglobalized world are the ones that rule the future. They've got everything that they need locally. They're going to do very, very well. They will try to screw it up. They will fail. The green, looking pretty good, more or less where they are now. Yellow and brown is where things fall apart. Now, the yellows have something going for them. Maybe they're self-sufficient in food or energy, or they have a particularly unified population that doesn't mind a few hardships here and there. They'll suffer through. The browns can't. The browns are utterly dependent upon the shape of the world as it is today, as it is maintained by the Americans, and they lack the capacity to impose a replacement system even in their own neighborhoods. And then the reds are the failed states, so if you don't know their names, don't bother learning them. I am not worried about managing or repulsing a Chinese or a Russian war of expansion. If the Chinese or the Russians move, it's their end. And part of me is kind of looking forward to that. I am worried about managing wars of collapse and wars of after effects as these major powers that have thrived in recent decades because of the American strategic overwatch, because they collapse under their own weight and leave gaping holes in the map. That's my concern. And For you guys, I would be looking for your next conflict, maybe a little closer to home. Now, here's the Mexican demography. It is one of the healthiest in the world. Now, about 25, 30 years ago, they started operationalizing NAFTA. And for the first time, Mexico started to really industrialize, and people moved off the farm into towns to take the manufacturing jobs. So it has dropped down, but it's not nearly as steep as almost every other country in the world. It is facing some degree of population collapse this century. If that trend holds, Mexico in 2060 will look about like we do now. And then they can start stressing about things like population structure. But for now, this looks pretty good. And that has allowed Mexico to do things that no one else can do. This is an export graphic. Everything on this side is what Peru exports, and everything on this side is where it goes. And this is pretty typical for a developing country, and doubly so for one in Latin America. They produce a lot of relatively low value-added products, and they export most of it to the industrializing economies of East Asia. So this is Peru. The value-added industries that we think of as manufacturing are these guys. They make up less than 3% of their export portfolio. And again, this is typical. This is Peru. Here are our Mexican neighbors. The Mexican economy is larger. The Mexican population is more value-added and more skilled. And the Mexican export portfolio is more advanced than the entirety of Central Europe. Mexico is the only country on the planet we need from an economic point of view. It's the only one we can't turn our backs on from an economic point of view. Think of Donald Trump. Think of what he said during his campaign the first time around about Mexico. Some very not nice things, I might add. Within a year, even he realized just how critical the relationship was. And the result, among other things, was NAFTA 2, and the friendliest bilateral relationship we have had with Mexico since its foundation as a republic in the 1800s. There are a lot of things about Donald Trump that I'm just like, oh, but wow, he was dead on that one. Which means that we need to pay attention to Mexico in a way we have not. This is the Mexican population structure. This is just a flat-out population density map. Take a look at Texas, and this is broadly what we think of in the United States when we think of normal. You have a dense population center surrounded by suburbs, and then speckles of small towns beyond that. Why? Because it freaking rains in America. You can have small towns because that's where the farms base. But look at Mexico. You get sprawling cities in the 1,000 miles from the border south, and then nothing. You don't have the population density of a downtown core because it was never an entrepot system like we have in Dallas or Kansas City or Des Moines. They're isolated from one another. Now, from an economic point of view, that means that Mexican labor is in limited supply. There is no hinterland to draw upon. So the first movers who take advantage of Mexican labor are the only ones who really win. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing the greatest industrialization push in this country right now as industrialists relocate manufacturing plant from East Asia to North America. They're starting to realize that the Mexicans have become a precious resource. But it also means that you guys face a complication.